Yeah, that's exactly it. I actually started off as a scientist thinking that I was going to be like hardcore biology researcher. I studied butterflies and was working on climate change. And I was like, I'm going to solve this. And it was really cool work. I got to like go camp in the Sierra Nevadas, catch butterflies for a job, which was pretty sweet. But I also was like realizing that there was a bigger problem than just the butterflies. So I was like, oh, people are having trouble understanding what I'm saying as a scientist. And I'm watching all these scientists around me have a lot of trouble getting across why their research is important and why we should care. And I'm also seeing like from the public side, they are also feeling disgruntled. Like they don't feel like a part of science and they feel like scientists don't have much heart. And I left the science world and was like a developer for a while, software developer, and started doing improv and was like, oh, I bet a lot of these tools from the arts could help scientists. And so I've been starting to experiment with that and like, I wonder if improv could help scientists speak about their work more. For about the past year, I have been like, I'll have a theme, and that way we'll see if we can get at that theme. And some have been like really great and felt really good. And there's been nights where I've just been like, that didn't work. And I kind of need to, that reflective process is like sometimes painful, but really helpful to be like, okay, why didn't that work? Or why did that work? And just kind of like, just iterating on it really is the practice.
Please join our next seminar in the Catalyst of Change series.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Catalyst of Change Women Leaders in Science seminar series. This series celebrates the incredible contributions shaping the future of science. This seminar will be conducted in English with live interpretation available in Spanish, French, and Hindi. We encourage you to join the conversation by following us on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, and X using the hashtag Women in Science to stay updated and share your thoughts on today's seminar. Don't forget to submit your questions and comments via Slido, which will be addressed in our interactive Q&A session following the presentation. Our featured speaker today is Nic Bennett, an expert in science and communication who researches power, ideology, and belonging as part of the SciComm Identities Project at Michigan State University. Nic will be joined by Lila Train, project manager for the Accelerating Genetic Gains in Maize and Wheat AGG project. With over 15 years of experience in strategic program design and partnership engagement, Lila offers valuable insights on leadership in the scientific community. We're also pleased to present a special video from Dr. Bram Govertz, Director General of CIMMYT, who will officially open today's event and introduce our distinguished speaker, Nic Bennett. Let's now turn to Dr. Govert's video presentation.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to what is yet again a Catalyst of Change Women Leaders in Science webinar. Today we have already our 30th Catalyst of Change, so we are celebrating a milestone. A milestone of a conceived series of seminars that is combining the fireside chat with a TED Talk. And that was in order to hear the women leaders' voices from our CIMMYT women leaders, interviewing women leaders from all over the world to bring in new leadership styles, to look at what and how it can be done, because you can be what you can see. Today, we are honored to have Nic Bennett as our 30th Catalyst of Change speaker. Nic holds a PhD in advertising and public relations and a master's degree on ecology, evolution, and behavior from the University of Texas, and a bachelor on biological sciences from Clemson University. Nic Bennett researches power, ideology, and belonging in science communication as a postdoctoral researcher on the SciComm Identities Project at Michigan State University. Bennett engages arts and science-based research and practices to critique, disrupt, and reimagine science communication spaces. Alongside scientists, artists, activists, and community members, she hopes to expand the circle of human concern in science communication and STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. Before this, Bennet researched climate change conservation biology, while earning her master's in ecology, evolution, and behavior from the University of Texas. She's also an improv performer, a director, and a technical designer, and has won 3 B. Iden Payne Theatre Awards and an Austin Chronicle Critics Table Award. Isn't this where art and science meet each other? I'm sure that you will enjoy, therefore, the learning journey, the life journey, and the leadership style of a true catalyst of change women leader. Nic, thank you for being with us. Welcome, and we are very intrigued by your story. Over to you.
Wow, thank you so much. So honored to be here and to be with this amazing group and to be among many others who have spoken here. I'm also really grateful that you got to see the happy ending of my story. So it is so often that we hear just that biography part of someone. You hear, oh, these are all the great things I'm doing. So today I wanted to give you a chance to see how there are challenges behind the scenes there, and to be a bit more vulnerable and to share those things with you. All right. So my own story, you heard that now I use the arts to think about how we work with science communication and belonging. And my own story is one of using the arts to rehumanize and resensitize myself. And I think of this in a very similar way to how I do my work. My work is also rehumanizing and resensitizing the sciences using the arts. And because my story has some darkness and some shadows that I've worked with, I'm happy to share with you. I'm happy to talk about today. There's also, because I have felt those things, there's also this ability to feel a lot of joy and a lot of love and a lot of light. So I think it's very important holding both of those pieces. I'm going to first open on a scene that is not so happy. And I promise we will get back to the brighter future that I'm now sitting in. I'll set the scene. We're outside of a university building in Austin, Texas. It's summer, so it's quite hot. And I'm zipping open the flap of what looks like a tiny tent. These are butterfly cages. They're like mesh white on the side, and they have green. And I'm opening the side of it, trying not to let the butterfly get out. There's these tiny little orange butterflies flitting around inside. And in my hand, I have a sponge like you would use for art. It's got honey and water, and it is very sticky. And I'm trying to I have it in a petri dish, and then I'm trying to put it in the tent so the butterflies can feed. And this sounds very simple, but in practice, more often than not, the little sponge will flip over and create a trap for the butterflies. The butterflies would just get into all sorts of trouble. So finally, I got the sponge in the tent, and the butterflies are letting out their long tongues, their proboscis, to drink the nectar. I've got them, you have to sit them perfectly in the sun so they can warm their little insect bodies to feed. And I zip back the cage and kind of sit back and admire my work. And so I'm right near, on campus, one of my favorite places on the University of Texas campus, the turtle pond, where the turtles are. I had just brought these butterflies back from the Sierra Nevada mountains of California, driven in a car all the way back to Texas, which is about a 2-day trip. And these, to me, were not just bugs. They were not just insects. These were my last hope. This was my final chance at gathering a little bit of, a last bit of data for my PhD research. I was in graduate school. I really wanted my PhD in ecology, evolution, and behavior at the University of Texas. The little orange butterflies were called Edith's checker spot. And I was interested in how their interactions with their plants and the timing and this geography might change with climate. And so I was taking a step back to admire my work, but I was also very, very nervous. I think all my organs were maybe piling up on top of each other and getting squeezed. And even worse, all of a sudden, this big gust of wind came through and blew every one of the cages tumbling into the turtle pond. And so I'm sitting there watching these tents sink beneath the surface of the turtle pond, these poor butterflies, my PhD. And I froze. I was just staring in horror. And what would have been like a normal moment, a moment of mistake, something that could be fixed if everything else was going well, was actually kind of a last moment for me. Everything wasn't going well. In graduate school, I had become a chameleon. I had become what everyone else wanted me to be. To me, I thought this was the price of being a scientist. I loved science so much that I was willing to sacrifice everything, including not being happy, becoming a person I didn't quite like, and kind of being a machine, and put all of my own stuff down in order to try to get this goal. I didn't know at the time that I was queer or trans, and I was drinking quite a lot to kind of help that stuffing down. There were days when I would just kind of walk to the grocery store and come back with a bottle of wine and just try to stuff down all of the feelings. I, at that time, felt like too much, not enough. I really wanted to be a scientist, and I thought that all of the hostility, all of the monotony, I thought that this was just the cost. I thought that this would be worth it. But watching these cages sink beneath the surface, and now it's funny, at the time it was not funny at all, I realized a piece inside of me had been dying for a long time. Moments like my advisor saying I didn't have what it takes, having my ass grabbed in the hallway of the building, all of the things I was told I should be to be a scientist. A deep, deep part of me cracked then. And it felt like a bad thing at the time, but I know now that it was a very, very good thing. This time I let it go. And so I start in kind of the darkest part of the story so that you can see what began maybe my chrysalis phase. For those of you who interact with insects, when an insect is in the chrysalis, they become goo. And I was also in this part of my life becoming goo. I had no idea what person would reappear from me walking away from this, from quitting grad school. But I did know that there was still a small part of me inside that had a flame, that did have love, that did have all of these things that mattered to me, and said, not this, but there is something else. So before we come back to this chrysalis, let's think about the caterpillar maybe that got us to this chrysalis. So that there's a lot of pain in that scene. And I've worked a lot with it. I'm very happy to share about these moments. But if you're in one of these moments now, it can be really hard. And you don't see that happy ending that my biography now has in it. And it can be really hard to remember all of the love that got me there and eventually got me out. So I think it's also important to think back. So let's go back to childhood. Let's go back to the caterpillar phase before we even got there. Ever since I was young, I wanted to be a scientist. I used to go to our local library and I would check out like every single book on science I could. My favorite was Sylvia Earle. She was a deep ocean marine biologist. She was like a brave explorer, a curious scientist. she would see animals we'd never seen before. I remember making a deal with my best friend in 3rd grade, Marissa. She was going to be an astronaut and explore the unknowns of space, and I was going to explore the deep ocean. So from an early age, I knew science had something very, very special for me. And in that form, science was and still is something that it always wraps me in wonder and awe. It can be about the best parts of being human, about how we connect to and care for our world and for each other. To me, that's what science was at the beginning. I was a very nerdy kid. It will surprise no one, but I have a poster on my wall in high school about all of the species that were in danger of going extinct. And I would look at them every day and think about how we might work and care and change. And these are all the things that brought me to that moment of watching the butterflies sink below the surface. So I took all the science courses I could. Science was also my ticket out of a very small southern US town that I felt like kind of a freak in. I hid in my books. I hid in my nerdiness. I didn't know that it wasn't safe for me, but it felt unsafe for me as a queer person in a small town. But I knew that education could be a way to explore more of the world. I also had lots of people encourage me. I remember I had an art teacher, Mr. Riches, who I hope I can go back home one day and thank. I remember telling him I wanted to be a marine biologist, and he said, "Oh, why not go to Australia? There's the reefs there." And I was like, I had only ever been to my very, very small town. And he said, "Why not?" And I think that why not still lives in my heart. I hope I get to go back one day to thank him. So while that first part of the story I was telling you was a pretty dark time for me, and there were some dark times that followed as I was gathering myself together, there was so much love and wonder and imagination that got me there. I've always loved fantasy books and sci-fi books. I've always loved drawing and making my little sister be in all of my plays for my family. There's a deep, deep love for the arts and sciences that I always had. And that is what actually brought me to that moment. And there were also lots of messages about a career. I have a couple of parents who were the first to go to college. And so they were very concerned that I be able to support myself. And I'm really grateful for everything that they've done. And I didn't want to be a doctor. So I was always trying to find sneaky ways to make maybe being a doctor something that was for social justice. Okay, I'll be a doctor, but I'll do Doctors Without Borders. So there was always science. There was always art. There was always a desire to make the world better. Then there were always people that believed in me. In college, I followed this passion for science. I knew that biology was going to be my major from the very beginning. I loved living things and understanding them. But within that field, I wasn't sure. My parents were saying, "Please get a job that will help you be stable." I'm always grateful to them for that. And there was this part of me that was like, but what about love? What about passion? One of my first jobs out of high school was working with fire ants, which are invasive in the US. And I remember working with my mentor there, Tim Davis, and he really believed in me. I would design experiments to keep fire ants out of bluebird nests, and he thought I was capable, thought I was smart. That's not always been the case with mentors, but I've had some really good mentors. I knew that I really loved being in the outdoors. I loved thinking and being curious. I didn't know if I was allowed to have a job like that. It seemed like too much fun. Through Tim, I also got to work where fire ants are from in Argentina. And study fire ants in their native habitat and with their native enemies. And that trip was really, really important to my career. I learned that I loved ecology. I started being someone who could take care of myself. I remember standing in the kind of soggy pampas that day, and we were laying out little slices of hot dogs, and then counting the ants that came to them. I remember looking around me and thinking like, oh, this is what I want to do. I knew I wanted a job where I could be an ecologist like this. I hate hot dogs. I hate the smell of that oil. That texture is still ugh, but I knew that there was something really, really cool happening. And this love of ecology, how living things work together, I was like, well, what are the jobs? And the only one I really knew was to be a professor. So I started getting research experience. I even got research experience that I wasn't even that interested in, but I, like many of us, just trying to get lines on the CV. I was doing biomechanics with turtles. It wasn't very interesting work, but I was starting to be that work of like, well, you should do this if you want this job. I was also concerned because I asked what we use this research for, and they were saying, oh, the Navy is interested in this research. And so I think I started realizing that science can be used for these ways of making the world better, and it can also be used for violence. But there were also some really great things about that role. It was my first big conference. But I think I started letting those shoulds pile up on me, what you should do. I started to separate that creative part of myself. I started becoming a very narrow person. I had hobbies like college radio, but I kept science just science. I tried to do the right things, to be the right person who could have that job in science. Even though I got into it for the love, I started operating in very mechanical ways that became very lifeless and didn't let me be my full self. But let's go back to the chrysalis. Let's go back to the goo. So what did I do when I said not this? I won't lie to you and say that I had this great plan. I had no idea where I was going to go from there. I just knew that I wanted to live a life where I didn't have to run away from my life. And I didn't want to become someone I didn't like. So as someone who was, and I was drinking quite heavily at the time, and you may not relate to that experience of abusing alcohol or drugs, but I'm sure you can relate in this modern age to wanting to escape or dissociate when things feel very overwhelming. I used to use alcohol as that. I used to kind of use it to pull a numb blanket over myself, to hide from my feelings. So part of my own work as a human has been building a life I don't want to run from. Part of that has been getting involved in community organizing. Part of it has been learning to creatively express myself. You heard in that video how I use improv to think about science communication. And piece by piece, very, very slowly, very, very gradually, I became someone I loved again. I became someone I'm proud of because now I live with my values and I live in those moments instead of only living for goals and sacrificing those values along the way. And so my own experiences with science and academic life in the US actually also really shaped my interest. You heard in my biography that I study belonging, so I'm really interested in how these spaces can be more liberated, more joyful. That is my work now. I'm very grateful now that I dropped out of graduate school that first time. After leaving that, I was able to reconnect with myself. I became a whole person. And when I came back in science communication, I was really curious about these moments that feel like we can be our full selves. And now, after dropping out, I do have a PhD in advertising and public relations, as you heard. And in this next interview, in a section later on, I'm happy to talk more about that work. But I just wanted to give you some background into what looks like a very linear path on paper has come from kind of facing some darkness and saying, no, not this. I would like to get in touch with myself, be a full person. And then I came back to the sciences to try to see if we can do that through communication to help everyone feel like they can be their full selves in science. And that gets us on to my research, but I'll leave that to Lila to guide the conversation where she is most curious to learn about my work, and I'll hand it over to her.
Okay. Thank you so much, Nic. That was so inspiring, and it really, really sets the tone, I think, for this conversation that you and I are going to have. And just for everyone out there, in case you wanted to know, my name is, again, Lila Train, and I work in the Sustainable Agri-Food Systems program. And my background is in international development studies. And the reason why I wanted to interview Nic today was really I just find paradigm shifters fascinating. And Nic, that's how I would probably describe you. I'd say, it's beyond the scientific objectives, beyond the science itself. How do we conceptualize our work? How does it impact others? And how do they impact us? So at CIMMYT, we work in agricultural research science. We aim to have an impact on the lives of smallholder farmers. How does our work really impact them? How do they impact us? But before, which is a very broad question. But before we get there, I wanted to pick up a little bit on the project that's been mentioned several times that you're in right now, the SciComm project at the University of Michigan. Perhaps you could talk a little bit more about that. And I'm also very interested in knowing what you mean specifically by the circle of human concern in science communication and STEM. So over to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm delighted to be able to have this conversation. So these are related. So both of these questions talk to one another. So the SciComm Identities Project is a multi-year project, but the main idea is, how do we train scientists, specifically environmental scientists, who have marginalized identities? For us, we're thinking about racially or ethnically marginalized identities in the US context. How do we center identity and culture in our trainings? So in contrast, most of the science communication trainings that happen focus on skill building. They do great work, but they think about, like, how do you remove the jargon from your work? We don't really think about someone's identity, someone's culture as a piece of that. And because of that, we can tend to uplift the dominant voices. So in the SciComm Identities Project, we're thinking about how might we redesign trainings to be not only more inclusive, but like equitable. And that feels very related to your second question of the circle of human concern. That's a term that I borrow from the Othering and Belonging Institute that's out of Berkeley. They do wonderful work on what does it mean to, how do we think about belonging? And so this circle of human concern is a concept that they have of, like, when we design spaces like you do, who is included, who has access, who's able to get there. Once people get there, are they able to use the resources? Are they able to speak up? So that circle of human concern is such a lovely, vibrant term that John Powell of the Othering and Belonging Institute came up with. And we think about that in our trainings too, of like, who feels like their stories are being represented. An example might be very helpful here. So in the last time we were doing trainings with scientists, the SciComm Identities Project is both like, we run a fellowship and do the messy work of training, and we do research on the side. We were talking about storytelling, and we made a mistake in that we brought in a lot of storytelling tools from Hollywood, which are very Western, which are very hero's journey, which are very individual. And our fellows are, each fellow has a unique makeup of different identities. And they pushed back and they said, these are not the stories of my community. And so those types of conversations are what we're thinking about when we think about expanding the circle of human concern, who sees their stories and the way we tell stories in those spaces.
Thank you. Yeah, oftentimes I think a lot of the communication, I think we envisage it as being unidirectional, and I think the circle metaphor is very important. Yeah. Okay, so you are also involved in a number of really interesting other projects. And there was one that stuck out for me just because it's so different from anything that we would see at CIMMYT normally or in agricultural research. And particularly in the form that it was delivered. So you participated in a landscape study that was funded by the Alan Alda Center for Communication Science, and it was on art-science collaboration programs. And what's interesting about this was the way you presented the findings, and you presented them in a comic format using bunnies. So my question would be, why bunnies, first of all? And then if you could tell us a little bit more about the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science, and also, if it's not too much to ask, about art science collaboration programs in general, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you. I'm delighted that this project delighted you too, because this was like a thing I did for fun, and then it became a bigger thing. So the Alan Alda Center was mostly involved in being a platform for the comic. The research itself was funded by Wellcome Burroughs and Rita Allen Foundation. And so they were very curious about art and science very broadly. And so we were thinking about, okay, art and science seem very important. Everyone's talking about it, but what is being done? And we've done many studies like this for science communication training. What is out there, like a landscape study, is a little bit different than maybe a ecology landscape study. We're essentially saying, what's out there? What are people thinking? How are people designing these programs? So in the same way we do that for science communication programs or journalists, we were doing this for art science collaboration programs. And so I got the very fun job of creating a database of all these programs and then getting to talk to people who design these programs. And I'm particularly interested in the ways that science and art kind of collide together and the spaces that can be created there. I think there can be more of a sense of belonging in these spaces when they're developed well. And for instance, like when I talk to people, they talked about the amount of money that goes towards arts and sciences is very, very different. And this puts the arts at a lower power level sometimes with sciences. But the way that they designed their collaborations was to let either artists lead, to give them some more power, or to develop really long-term relationships. So there was all sorts of really cool stuff that we found about how do you even collaborate between things that feel as different as art and science and have so many similarities. The bunny comic, I've made, this is the second comic I've made of some of my research. And I think it is me wanting to be in conversation with and maybe impact more than just people who read the articles that are behind paywalls. So I made one of a past work that I had been commissioned to do. The bunny one was just, I have a bunny. And I was like, how do we visually, and I was going through the different findings, and often I'm drawing doodles, and I was just like, how do we explain something like power sharing? And I'm like, oh, bunnies on a seesaw. And I was like, the bunnies part is totally random. Also that I had a bunny and that I thought it was very cute. And I think science communication, embracing cuteness, can also expand who feels like they belong in science. But also just, for the fun of it. So that's kind of how I think about those things. And I'm continually trying to find ways to be in conversation with more people, because while I love like creating knowledge for its own sake, I really want the knowledge to be used to make life better for people.
And so maybe you could help us, because I think it's like a new idea for a lot of people listening and watching on the webinar. What is an art science collaboration program? You mentioned that you did a landscape study. So what were some of the key takeaways from that study? Like, what is it? And yeah.
Yeah, great question. I should have put that in my first explanation. They take a lot of different forms. So we kind of had to, in our own study, like you do in any study, define it and then also learn the definition from other people. But for our sake, it was at least two people, so not a single individual. There are definitely people who are hybrid individuals. I think I might be one, who do both art and science, but they're kind of collaborating in their own brain. But for this study, it had to be at least two people collaborating across disciplines. So, and it needed to be scientists and artists. So it was everything from dancers collaborating with climate change scientists to talk about the tides in Boston. Some of the programs were in universities, some were separate. So like one of the examples of a university program was a professor who teaches about comics and a physics professor. And they paired up, and now they help science students and comics students work together to make comics about their art. But there are also big ones that are outside of universities that have been thinking about this for a while. The National Academies in Washington, D.C. has their own program that thinks about the cultural side of things. So our definition was pretty broad. So the database was also pretty big. But any time that we had people from different fields coming together to think about these things.
And what were some of the opportunities or the challenges that you uncovered through this study?
Yes, some of the key findings. Thank you. So definitely there's not one size fits all. So as much as we would love to say, like, here's the formula for an art science collaboration, it's very dependent on where you are, your context, what money you have. And then the main other finding was thinking about designing for that power sharing. So naming that an artist might be coming in and really needing, there's not as much funding for arts in the US context, which is what this study was. And so making sure they get paid fairly. Whereas the scientists, if they are already at a university, they may already have those funds. Letting the artist lead in things. And there were quite a lot of other findings that the comic puts together as well. But one of my favorite is also thinking about how these spaces, actually more people could see themselves in them than a purely science space or even a purely art space. Art spaces can be just as feeling exclusive as science spaces can to some people. But for some reason, when we smush these together, something new can happen and people can find new ways of expressing themselves. And then I think a last finding that I'll share and invite others to look at the comic if they want to see more was just thinking about the vulnerability and the humility that it takes to do these collaborations. It's at least two, usually more, experts coming together. So people who are used to being the top of their field. So you have a preeminent physicist coming in, talking to a preeminent musician, and they want to make music about the physics. But the physicist may have some knowledge of music, but they're kind of a beginner there. And so there's a humility and a vulnerability that happens. And I think is something really important is happening there in a collaboration where you are learning to see the world through someone else's perspective, embrace other ways of knowing. And then eventually, what I'm most interested in is that circle of human belonging again, of this is a space where different ways of knowing, different identities are being welcomed rather than just one. So that my own biography talking about those academic spaces, and I've done some research on this, we we feel like we can only be one version of ourselves. It's very limited. But in these other spaces, sometimes when we're creatively expressing ourselves or other reasons, we get to be our full selves. So I think that is one of the most interesting things that happens there.
Yeah, and I would love, it's not the forum, but I would love to know more about how we could do an art science collaboration in the agricultural research field. But
That would be
it's a
delightful.
big,
We should
it's a
definitely
big,
chat.
it's a big topic. But maybe a little bit more concretely, how can what can scientists do to ensure that we're creating spaces for those who may not be represented, so that they can feel that the science community is open and encouraging of their participation and inclusion as well. So what would be, yeah.
Yeah. So from the scientist point of view?
Yep.
Yeah. So as a scientist, a lot of it is one of the first things I chat with scientists about when you are talking about your work. And it's often more important to think about, what we usually worry about is making sure we get all our information in there. And I was even catching myself do that today in my biography. I still do this where I'm like, we need to make sure we get all the facts in there. But as anyone who has sat through a lecture knows, people are not coming away with all of the information. And that's okay. But they will come away with how you made them feel. So paying attention to goals beyond just sharing information is really helpful. And if we want to go even deeper, we might think about what communication even is. So communication might not just be me spraying information and making sure people get it. It might actually look more like a dialogue. It might look more like if I'm starting a relationship with someone, it might look like me doing a lot of listening and seeing what other people need and then bringing in my expertise, or and then going even deeper from dialogue, we might also think about identity and culture. How am I, in my multiple identities and my cultural background, who are my communities that are going to trust me the most? Who am I working with? Who are the leaders in the community that are already trusted? Who we can work with in these ways? So kind of going from that model of like spraying information at people to thinking more about listening and dialogue, and maybe even going deeper and thinking about science communication actually as cultural exchange, and your audience knowing just as much, if not more, than you. Maybe their expertise is in their lived experience, or maybe they know the land way better than you do, but they know something that you don't. And so how are we doing this exchange?
Nic, thank you so much. I think that's all the time we have for our chat. So I'll turn it over to Daniela, but thank you very much for that response and for your responses to my questions. Over to you, Daniela.
Thanks. Thank you, Nic and Laila, for that insightful and engaging conversation. We would now like to invite our audience to participate. You can raise your hand to ask a question or share a comment, or also submit your questions via Slido. We have already a couple of questions here. The first one, Nic, is what advice would you offer to young or mid-career professionals facing challenges in their careers?
First of all, that you are not alone. I think I thought I was alone, and that was a part that makes the pain even worse. And now, as a researcher, I can tell you, evidence-based, many graduate students, many early career professionals are feeling these challenges. So the first part is knowing you're not alone. And the second part is, especially in our careers, if yours is relatively similar to mine, we often have one mentor, and they hold a lot of power over us. they could be really, really, in my story, there were some people that came up. They can be really, really helpful when someone believes in you, when someone trusts you, when someone supports you. That could be really powerful. And when you don't have that, it's a big, big loss. And only having one node can be really fragile. So something as a young professional I would encourage you to do that I wish I had done, and now I'm more intentionally doing, is make yourself a constellation instead of a single star. So you may have an official mentor and they can serve some roles for you. Maybe they are great. But during my PhD, the COVID lockdown happened and my mentor had 3 children. And so he did disappear for a while. But because I had a constellation, there were other people. And that one mentor can't be everything to you. Maybe someone is an emotional mentor. Maybe another person is your writing buddy. Maybe another person is your coffee on Tuesday buddy. But just building yourself a network and a community like you're building here is one piece of helping make yourself really strong and resilient rather than only having a single star, which is a little bit more fragile. That would be my biggest advice. And to remember you're not alone and that a lot of us are feeling these same things, and to not blame yourself. A lot of what I study now is that sometimes the systems are not fair, and we're working on that, but not to take that on yourself as your own failing.
I love it. Thank you very much, Nic. We have another question. Are there any particular challenges, do you think, for agricultural researchers in communicating their work to the public compared to other disciplines?
Yes, I think y'all have a very specific challenge. And I'm mostly thinking about my context, but I would love to learn from those in the audience if you want to keep in touch afterward. But I'm thinking about some of the scientists we work with are agricultural researchers, which means in the US, talking to farmers quite a bit. And in the United States, farmers and scientists can often be very different. They can be very politically different. They can be they can have different identities, cultures. And so what does it mean to build a bridge with someone who's very, very different from you? So instead of saying, oh, wow, they don't believe in climate change or they don't believe in this science, othering someone, how do we then build a bridge with people? I have to do this in my own family. And I know probably people in the audience do too, but I think that is one of the main gifts that I've seen agricultural researchers think about in terms of their care for their work, their care for the world, and then caring for the people that might be using their science. Does involve quite a bit of bridging across difference. We're never going to be the same. And we don't want us all to be the same. We would like a world where we're all quite different, but it does mean talking to people who have very different beliefs than you. And so how do we do that? We go deeper and we go to those shared values and we build a bridge little by little and with time and with trust.
Thank you, Nic. And on the same note, there is another question. What advice would you give an organization like CIMIT that wants to help build science communication capacity?
Yes, building science communication capacity. It's at multiple levels. So let me think. Often communication and I'm mostly thinking about scientists, but often it is not something that we are rewarded for. Often it's something that's, if you are a researcher, your research is what lets you keep your job and lets you put it on your resume. Your teaching is something you're supposed to do, but you don't want to spend as much time on it. And then communication often gets treated much like teaching. It gets kind of devalued in comparison to research. And so I think an organization like this, what y'all are doing here is an example of that, of placing value on this is one way, and helping reward people for it. A lot of people do it because they want to themselves, but it doesn't hurt to help people also feel rewarded for their work. And so just thinking kind of at an organization can help at the systems level.
Great, thank you. And the last question, what are the biggest insights you found in working with so many scientists over the years in science communication, and what excites you right now the most about your current work?
Insights. One of the most exciting insights I had, it feels very similar to my biography, in that once I started talking to junior scientists about, why are you doing science communication? It's not going on your resume, but maybe one line. It's not giving you publications. Why are you doing this thing that you're not rewarded for? They often told me in many different ways that it helped them be their full selves. And so I think one of the most exciting things to me is, while we do want to change these systems so that people can feel like their whole selves in every place, and so that multiple types of people can feel they belong, there are little pockets of belonging that happen. And we have the power to create those things. And so to me, like, while I am interested in very big change, those little spaces where we start living as if we're already joyful and already liberated, those are also really, really exciting to me. And I think that also plays into the answer to the second part of the question of some of the research we're doing now is on scientists who are marginalized in these spaces. So there's often a lot of, the stories contain a lot of pain. So it's often like, oh, we do a survey and we see the gap you feel between who you are and who other people see you are. Like, some things can feel very painful. And there are so many gifts that people bring, depending on their cultural background, depending on their identities. And so those of us who are on the margins often have insights into how these systems can change. We often bring in new ideas. We often change fields. I was feeling so complimented by the paradigm shift idea. But those of us who are on the margins are often the ones who change paradigms. Even the science says that, like, people who are new to fields, who change fields, people who don't come in with all of the dominant identities, who look like a scientist should be. We're the ones that can bring that change. And I think that is some of the most exciting pieces to me.
I love it. Thank you, Nic, very much. And thank you for sharing your professional journey and your insightful approach to science communication. Your contributions are both impactful and inspiring. Thank you very much, Laila. And on behalf of CIMIT and Dr. Bram Govertz, we're deeply grateful for your time and expertise today. To our audience, thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at the next session of Catalyst of Change, happening in 2 weeks. Until then, thank you and have a wonderful day or evening. Thank you very much.
Let me start first by saying that Power for All is a global campaign focused on accelerating the end of energy poverty through decentralized renewable energy solutions. And one of those is actually our integrated energy approach, which we're currently testing, as you said, in Uganda. And this is essentially a partnership between the utility company and the mini-grid developer. And what's great and so efficient about this is that it leverages the comparative advantages of the two to deliver faster and cheaper electrification. So essentially, you're getting the best of both worlds. You're getting the cheap access to capital, the large consumer base, the scale, but on the other hand, you're getting this, technology-driven, data-driven approach from the mini-grid developer. But most importantly, this consumer-centric approach that develops consumption, because that's the key to the business models work is that we do a lot of demand stimulation through appliance finance programs. To achieve universal electrification, we would need about 10 million new connections. If we do the business as usual approach, like the grid extension approach, that's estimated to cost about $7 billion. And those costs are very unlikely to ever be recovered because of what I was saying earlier. There's very low consumption base. These are consumers that either do not know how to use energy or that can't afford to buy any appliances. So that's why this integrated approach that delivers electrification at half the connection costs and 3 times the pace is so important and could be a game changer, not just in Uganda, but for the entire region.
Please join our next seminar in the Catalyst of Change series.